the one thing that tenants really opposed was the fact that although the kitchens were quite well organised in terms of cupboards and things like that, they were actually quite small. And that was intentional because this is the era, the 20s and 30s was the era of domestic science. And the idea was that the kitchen, which has always been the living room, in the early cottages, you didn't live in the parlour at the front, you lived in the kitchen. The kids, Dad came home from work, the house was nice and warm and aired because our houses need someone to be in them all day and manage them. Opening windows, closing windows, pulling washing out, all of that sort of thing, keeping the home fires burning, that sort of thing. But the architects of the time thought that the kitchen was a workplace and that families should be kept out of there. So I did a book on the history of state housing, but one thing that we should remember about state housing is state advances loans that the government provided at the time, and these don't date from that first Labour government, they go right back to the Liberal government of the early 1900s. State advances loans, cheap government loans to people. My parents were school teachers and they built a house using them. They built 4 times as many houses as the government ever built on its own. So giving money to people actually works in terms of them being able to address their housing problems. So why won't the market sort out our housing problems? Well, I've practiced as an architect for umpteen years, and if I'm a developer and I do the hard part of building a house, getting the consents, all of that sort of thing, then I'm not going to sell it at a cheap rate when for $50,000 I can chuck some tiles in there. You probably watched The Block or something like that. I can chuck some tiles, some fancy lighting and a few appliances in there. I can get another $100,000 out of that house. So why would I bother doing an affordable house? So the market has not solved any of our problems. And by the way, we've had a housing shortage since Pākehā got here in the 1840s. So it's not something recent, it goes all the way back. And then KiwiBuild at the moment tends to have kind of like bought into this idea of chucking money at developers and getting them to kind of, getting things over the line that will put a few more houses out there. But the problem with KiwiBuild, which probably, even though I like this government because it is attempting to do things, one of the reasons Phil Twyford lost his role in KiwiBuild is that he was too enamoured of the old ways of doing things, which was chucking money at developers. And Phil Twyford also believed in releasing the rural-urban boundary that we have in Auckland that stops sprawl. So we have ended up with, as you can see in Kawhata, which is kind of halfway between Pokeno and Huntly. There are KiwiBuild houses out there, but no one wants them. So most of the KiwiBuild houses, because they've followed this kind of developer-driven status quo kind of thing, they have ended up in paddocks in the back of Beyond, no offence to people who live down there, but they're not solving Auckland's housing problem or any other urban areas, and they're not affordable either. So that's the problem with KiwiBuild. I've got hopes for KiwiBuild though, because Helen O'Sullivan is the new head of KiwiBuild, and she's the former CEO of Auckland, a developer in Auckland. And Auckland have, this is a 4 or 5 story building in Surrey Crescent in Auckland. And it is, Auckland's buildings address what they call the missing middle. So rather than building townhouses like Fletcher Residential do, or building big, 15, 20 story apartment buildings, they've been building 3 story walk-up apartment buildings or 4 or 5 story apartment buildings that have lifts. And these have been, most of them, some of them haven't been well designed, but most have been quite well designed. And the first one, also called Auckland, You can't see it in this image, but it's got trees on the roof. There is no penthouse on the roof. The roof of this building is for the owners of the apartments to go up and use as a communal space, which I think is a really good idea in terms of building community. Because one thing we do know about apartment buildings is they tend to erode communities. Auckland have also been using some of the ideas that we know work in apartment buildings at the moment. I've got my office in a really tall apartment building, and it has one lobby, and it's also partially a hotel. So with everyone coming down into one lobby, 35, 36 floors, if someone spills some coffee in there, no one mops it up, because it's someone else's problem. It's a public space. Whereas if you break apartment buildings down into lobbies that serve, say, 6 apartments, you get a sense of ownership of that area. So if someone, makes a mess, someone will tidy it up, because it's your own front yard, effectively. So they've done some very smart stuff, and my hope is that Kiwi Build moves away from suburban housing aimed at affordable housing for people, and moves more towards a medium density rent-to-buy model, where we build these buildings and young people or people who have never been able to afford a house can move into there, and they can rent, and they can rent to buy. So that's my hope for that. And you may look at, well, you can't really see it, but another big hope for that sector as well is that the super funds and the iwi, in the post-settlement phase where they've got their money, will move into that area and do long-term rentals. And we are starting to see that happen. And this is at Hobsonville Point. So already we've got long-term rental in there. And we talk about housing affordability in this country, but already 30% of New Zealanders rent and are likely to keep on renting. So we have got a big rental crisis as well, and I think we should move first to addressing that rental crisis, and then secondly, housing affordability. And you might look at one of those and go, well, I don't know if I want to live in a little box a few floors up, and that's why the urban design of the area is very important as well. And these are at Hobsonville Point. You can't really see in that, but there's lots of green space designed into it. There's a ferry into town and good connections, and there are schools there and cafes and shops nearby and things like that. So I always say that the housing crisis is not just about putting roofs over people's heads, it's about building communities. That's a really significant aspect of it. So out there at the moment, and this is an image of a Bunnings flat pack house. They have been going great guns for Bunnings. They've been flogging heaps of them since they launched them early this year. And there's a big appetite out there for people to sort things out themselves for their whānau and their family and their friends. And the Bunnings houses are not particularly well designed, and I've got flack from the architectural community for saying I approved of it, and they all say, oh, they're so badly designed. But they're a package, they're a kit set. And one of the things that terrified people about new builds is that you can really go off the rails quite fast in terms of financial risk. And first you've got to find a builder, and then you've got to go through the whole process. So I won't bang on about the Bunnings houses, but they are addressing an issue. But you've got to have a backyard. And actually most of them are being sold to farmers for rural housing. So share milkers and all of that sort of thing, which I think is good, because we do have issues with our housing stock as well. So there are a lot of people in rural communities working on farms, in forestry and things like that, living in kind of like 1920s cottages that are falling apart, like cold and damp. But those Bunnings kit set houses are not do-it-yourself. And because of the leaky building crisis, we live in a really risk-averse period at the moment. And I know all about it, as I tell my students, and occasionally the public of New Zealand. I was responsible for 2 leaky homes. One cost me 30,000, one cost me 20,000, which is nothing really. So I wasn't that bad. But kind of like, you know, it was a major issue, and it's really changed things in the country. So building your own home, or even, you know, you can maintain your own home, you can, but kind of the moment you start, you cannot replace all your windows. You cannot build a deck on your own. This is restricted building work. So it wasn't the do-it-yourselfers that caused the housing crisis. It was people like me, it was the building industry, and it was the councils, and it was central government. So we've gone wrong there by taking away power from people to house themselves. So I think you should be able to build your own Bunnings kit set house, you know, with a bit of good guidance. So anyway, I'll just flick through these images, but Prefab New Zealand had a competition 2 years ago now called Snug Housing. So it's very easy to Google Snug, and there's a much smarter range, much more cleverly designed houses that you fit in your backyard, 65 square metres each. So kind of like, you know, my mother-in-law who lived with us for a period of time, all my kids who have coupled up and come back home to roost, they could live in one of those because we've got a backyard. So I'll just flash through those because you can't really see them. And just before I get into co-housing, another big possibility is what we call naked housing. So that's where the government, or you know, local government or central government could build, just like the Auckland 3-storey, 4-storey, 5-storey buildings, build an apartment building, and then you walk into it and it's an empty shell. And on one wall you've got a kitchen sink, and you can put an oven on one side and a fridge on the other, and that's your kitchen. And behind a wall you've got a toilet and a shower. But you can go into that and you can buy that really cheaply, and then with do-it-yourself, you know, and you won't go wrong because the external envelope's there, it's not going to leak or anything like that, and you can gradually kind of, with a bit of sweat equity, and going to IKEA or the warehouse or something like that, put together a kitchen and a bathroom. And then when you have your kid, you can put up an internal wall and create a bedroom in there. So that's a possibility. Again, the market won't do that, because by the time I've built that building to the shell stage and got the plumbing and the electrical in, I've done all the hard part. So I'm not going to sell that to anyone. I'm going to chuck, you know, I'm going to do the easy interior design stuff. So it's got to be central government or community housing trusts who do that side of things. So the one area that's doing really well at the moment is the retirement homes. And you'll know that. And everyone in New Zealand knows that, because wherever I go, they are booming away. And there are some real pluses with them. They are kind of like generally medium density now. They're warm and dry. They've got community facilities in there. My mother-in-law lived with us when our kids were younger. And then at the stage that, you know, really she was having problems falling over during the day and, you know, other issues, she had to go off to Silman Village in Auckland, a kind of a retirement home. And she was really upset about that. But actually when she got there, she enjoyed it. Because during the day in the suburbs, the kids were off at school, we were at work, and she was rattling around in a house on her own. She was walking up and down on the street, didn't know anyone. They were all out as well. And then when she was in Silman Village, in the retirement home, there were all these people of the same age, the same era, and they were talking about, you know, the things that we all talk about back in the day. But these retirement homes are also very, you know, there is a lot of environmental effect, and they're also very good at siphoning your grandchildren's inheritance out of your pocket. And they have very good contracts, their terms, that are kind of like virtually, very difficult to understand. And there's a real problem when you're trying to get out, and there are all sorts of issues with them. But something very similar to them, in terms of the physical form, is co-housing. And that's mainly what David said to me, let's talk about co-housing, because I bang on about it on the radio all the time. So co-housing is actually a spectrum. So at one end we've got co-housing, which means that you may have a development just like a retirement home where you have your own small house. It's got your own bathroom, your own kitchen, maybe a second bedroom, all of that, the third bedroom, all of that sort of thing. But generally it is cooperatively owned, and there's a common facility in there where you might go and have a meal together or meet together, or an event once a week. At kind of the other end of this spectrum, we've got co-living. And that's more like if you ever went to university and lived in a hostel or a dorm or something like that, it's more like that. So that's more attractive to young people. So you might end up with pretty much a bedroom with an ensuite and no cooking facilities. You may have a fridge and a microwave and a sink in your room, but generally you come down to a much bigger common area and cook every night. So co-housing and co-living are on a spectrum, and also some of them have co-working facilities in there as well. And they're very popular with people because if you're starting up a new business, you don't have to go and rent somewhere. You can just get a spot in a place. Plus I know lots of architects working in that co-working arrangements now. You share the photocopier, you share the printer and all of that sort of thing. Plus you make lots of connections. So almost in certain countries in Europe, Germany, Scandinavia, 20% of the population live in co-housing. So it really is a thing in Europe. And it's also happening here now. This book, Co-Housing Inclusive, it's by Michael Lafond, who is an American but lives in Berlin. And runs a institute there that focuses on this sort of thing. And he's done a couple of these, and I had him over earlier in the year, and he toured New Zealand and did a few talks. And as you can see there, Co-op, Architecture New Zealand just recently had an article in there on co-housing, and there are many more of them happening in the country than you might suspect. Down in Christchurch at the moment, there's at least 5 going on down there. There's one in Hill Street in Dunedin. They're all over the place. And there is a history of them happening in New Zealand as well. So Maori, of course, always lived in Papakainga. So Maori were quite itinerant seasonally and would, in their rohi, would move around and stay in various villages at a particular time of the year, when it was time to catch sharks or eels and come up dry those. So there is a long history of communal living in this country. And also the Kirk government in the 1970s came up with the Ohu scheme. But I don't generally talk too much about that because people go, no, hippies. But there was one down in Waipu, and a colleague is still involved in that and teaches at the Unitec School of Architecture, Kerry Francis. And in the late 70s, early 80s, Michael Payne, an architect in Whanganui, designed the Quaker settlement there, called Quaker Acres by the locals. But there are about 20 or 30 houses living there, and again it follows the same kind of model that I'll talk about in just a minute. And then in the early 90s, Earth Song, a housing collective in Auckland, was started by Robin Allison. She was a student at the School of Architecture when I was there. And I'm just hoping, yeah, you can kind of see this image here. So I put it on its side, and that's north there. So that's a house there. So you can see there's quite a few houses. And what most co-housing developments do in terms of design is leave the cars at the gate, and you can see them up the top there, and that frees up so much space. If a developer had that same site, this is what we'd end up with. A big road down the middle, a turning circle there, some off-street parking, and then where we've got a house, we are compelled, in most places in New Zealand, to park 2 cars on site and be able to reverse them on site and then take them out onto the road again. So cars, housing cars, eats up so much suburban land in places like this, as well as in big cities like Auckland. And as well as housing cars, so we're wasting land by parking cars there, and also with all these hard surfaces, we get lots of impermeable surface. So all the stormwater is collected on those. It picks up a few of the, what's dropped out of the, engine oil, what's dropped out of the exhaust pipe of your car, a few cigarette butts and things like that. It goes into the stormwater system, and then we pump it into our creeks and our waterways throughout here. So co-housing developments that are kind of like low density, such as this one, are much more effective. So it does mean that if it's pouring down with rain, you do have to carry your groceries 50 or 60 metres and then go back to the car again. But these are really minor problems in terms of the amenity that you get. So most co-housing schemes, we think the optimum is somewhere between kind of like 10 to 30 households. And you do tend to get so a couple of people driving the development of the whole thing. But I'm a big believer in them because they have a whole lot of advantages. One of them is when you're in there early, you are the designer. You are one of the designers of the whole site. So as you can see here, that's north over there, and all of these houses in these rows here are all facing north, and they're all getting direct sunlight. Whereas an other option that you can see there, where we chop the whole site up, you end up with, it's compulsory in where I live in Auckland to have a 1 metre side yard. And that's just a waste of space. And it ends up on the south side being muddy and rainy. You can put a rubbish bin in there, but it's not going to be much use for anything else. So in areas like this, we have much more common green space. So they are very effective design-wise. And when we come to the questions, we'll talk a bit more about the organisation and the politics of them. In Australia, the main ones that are happening at the moment, more urban of course, in Melbourne and Sydney, are the Nightingale houses. And they tend to be sort of 3, 4 story, 5 story buildings like that. Various architects working on them. So co-housing, there are a couple of websites that you can go and have a look at. In Surrey Crescent, in Auckland at the moment, there's one called Co-House that some friends of mine are doing. And you can't really, well, you can see a bit of the diversity of people that you see in there. Much more multi-generational, of course, than your retirement home. So you can think of living in a neighbourhood where you've got a built-in babysitter. But also it's possible to kind of, this co-house development has a range of house types as well. So people being in there early, you can say, no, I really only need 1 bedroom or 2 bedrooms, because I know in the overall development there will be some guest rooms as well. So if my grandkids are coming out for the weekend to see me, I can rent that guest space and they can use that. If there's some, and also in whether it's kind of a low rise or a high rise, medium density model, if there's some room or some space that never gets any sun, then you can that can become storage. So rather than having, when you downsize, rather than having to go off to Storage King or something like that, you can have storage on site. Or if someone's starting up a trade me empire and is, constantly selling LPs or something like that, they can rent that space as well. So there are all sorts of good possibilities, and it's a real happening thing at the moment. That's the plan of the Surrey present one. Down in, as I mentioned, down in Christchurch, there's quite a few. Colette's Corner, you get a rough idea there. That's more of a mixed-use development, very ambitious, with lots of shops and workplaces down the bottom, and then a series of apartments up the top, 3 stories high. And they're gathering funds for that through crowdfunding at the moment, and also buying shares. You can't really see this. You are not paying, so when you buy an apartment, you have already paid, you're paying the developer for their profit, you're also paying for the marketing, you're paying for a whole bunch of stuff. So Nightingale in Australia reckon they can do co-housing for 20% less than what a developer can do it for. So just getting to, we're at the end now. There are lots of pros to co-housing, but there are also some cons as well. So a lot of these people I know them quite well, and they're striking problems because basically councils don't understand what it is. The financial structuring of it is tricky. We've talked about owning shares in it, we've talked about kind of like different ways of managing it. Body corporates are pretty terrible in this country. So once you've got a co-housing model, it's even more difficult. So there's a real need to kind of like establish a decent template for it. And there are issues with when people sell, do they get the capital gain on that, or so there's a lot to be worked out in there. But there are a lot of people who are working on all these issues at the moment. But we think the government should be stepping in and kind of like helping in the establishment of templates to make more of this kind of thing happening, because it does have significant advantages in terms of physical design, and also the coming epidemic in New Zealand in the big cities is going to be one of loneliness and isolation as well. And so co-housing, co-living help address things like that. That's a couple of websites there. So on Radio New Zealand, as we've mentioned before, I do end up going on and on and on about it all the time, but if you are interested, if you're ever in Auckland, I run a talk series in the first half of the year in which we get people in talking about different ways of dealing with housing, and also my talks on, I don't just talk about co-housing, although it's my favourite thing. I also talk about all sorts of other issues, and they're all podcasts on Radio New Zealand. So that's it from me.